Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. The Vale 3005 AC. Sansa. Whether it was by virtue of her name or her cousin's orders, Sansa believing it was more the latter, she had been treated as if she was the most important lady in the Vale since she got here. People deferred to her, servants were at her beck and call, and she was even given seamstresses and material to make dresses and clothing more suitable to the Vale's style. That had been something she greatly appreciated, being able to dress more suitably than she had been since she arrived here. Her northern simplicity, while not frowned upon in the Vale, was something she knew the other ladies looked down upon her for. What made that harder for her to take is that left to her own choices, then she'd not have dressed down so much in the first place. It was instead something she had done only to ingratiate herself with the northern lords. Sansa had found that unlike when she was a girl and dressed in pretty things and used the best fabrics, it was not something the North wished to see in their ladies. And so she had complied to gain favor. Now as she stood in front of the looking glass, she felt more her true self. The silk dress was blue and brought out both her hair and eyes. Sansa frowned though at her covered shoulders, but she knew some things were beyond her control. Once she was sure that she looked her very best, she turned and walked from the room. The guards that Sweet Robin had made available to her, walking behind her as she headed to the hall to break her fast. She composed herself and took a breath before she entered, and immediately Robin looked her way, her cousin smiling to see her and bidding her join him. Sansa could see Lady Miranda, Lady Isla, and some of the other ladies of the court, looking at her with varying degrees of annoyance and jealousy. She'd monopolized Robin's time since her arrival, both during meals and the days and nights themselves, the younger boy quickly falling under her spell. "Cousin, you look beautiful. Blue truly is your color." Robin said, his attempts at flattery basic, but welcome, as it showed his interest. "And you look most handsome today, Sweet Robin," she said. Sansa had realized that how she had said it at first reminded the boy too much of his mother, and so had changed it, now emphasizing the sweet part which Robin seemed to enjoy. "We must meet with the lords today, Sansa, though I wish I could just spend my time with you," Robin said softly as he leaned into her, Sansa laughing as she brushed his hair from his face and watched him blush. "As do I, but they have questions that they need answers to, do they not?" she said, as if she was as upset as he, something she was very much not. "They do. They're fools, Sansa. Mother was right about that. I see how they look at me, and were I not as strong as I am," Robin said annoyedly. "Then I thank the Seven that my sweet Robin is so very strong, just as my aunt always said you would grow up to be," she said, brushing against his arm and seeing him puff up in pride. She had thought it would be harder, that it would take longer, and she'd face more resistance. Not from Robin himself. Saint-Cyr she'd ensnared her cousin, not more than a day or two after she'd arrived. All it had taken was the simplest pieces of flattery, most of which she remembered his mother would use from the last time she was in the Vale, and the promise of all she had to offer. Saint-Cyr wondered if none of the other women had touched or kissed Robin suggestively, and if so, why not? Had this been King's Landing then? The Lord of the Vale would have been surrounded by people trying to get into his bed, and given how Robin reacted to her touches and kisses, he'd have wed the first one who tried. Here, however, there seemed to be none of them doing the same thing, and it was not as if the women here were more chaste or virtuous. Lady Miranda had bedded 2 nights, including Sir Davith, since her arrival, and others were equally as free with their favors. She had though noticed that Robin didn't seem to be interested much in the ladies around him, Saint-Cyr putting that down to her own arrival, as he was very clearly interested in her, and in that he wasn't alone. Sir Harold Harding had also shown his own interest very keenly any time that he and Saint-Cyr found themselves alone. "After we speak to the lords, I'd most enjoy a stroll in the gardens, cousin, and then perhaps we can lunch in our spot," Robin said eagerly. "I'd very much enjoy that, cousin. Very much," she said, fluttering her eyes and smiling at him, as she delicately ate the food from her plate. She forced the last few bites of food down, her appetite suddenly fading as she knew her touches would be required once more today. As bad as doing those things felt to her, thinking of them was so much worse, and she swallowed her milk and pushed the plate away. Sansa looked out to see that Theon could see her concerned expression, and she smiled at him and shook her head. She'd had to intervene when they went to send Theon away. The Vale Lords and her cousin, just like Jon, not having appreciated all that Theon had done for her. Only Sansa, revealing more of Theon's truth than she had wished to, had allowed Robin to agree he could stay. Her cousin taking great delight in hearing that Theon had lost his manhood, and Sansa had luckily so far being able to stop him from saying anything publicly about it. "Shall we, cousin?" Robin said, offering her his arm as he stood up, Sansa smiling as she took it and wondering when it was that her smile became so practiced. She didn't look at those who stared her way when they walked from the hall. Sansa knowing exactly the thoughts that went through their minds and caring not about them. This meeting was the last remaining barrier to her becoming the Lady of the Vale, and once she was, then she would have the power she needed. All those who looked at her that way would be soon forced to show her the deference her position required, and with the Vale behind her, Robb's will could be contested. Sansa was certain that the Faith would back her and not the North when it came to that. Walking to the large meeting room, she could see that Robin was eager for this meeting to be done with too. Not for the same reasons as she, however, but he wanted it over, and that was something she could use if she needed. Robin was at heart still the same boy. He always had been, and was still prone to throwing temper tantrums if he didn't get his way. The Lords of the Vale had seemingly come to accept it was easier to give him what he wanted rather than deny him, and that Robin actually wanted so little that truly affected the Vale helped them with that. All of that would change when they were wed, though, as then what Sansa wanted would be what Robin would want too. She'd make sure of that. Entering the room, she saw most of the important lords of the Vale, Lady Waynwood, Lord Hunter, Lord Redfort, Lord Belmore, Sir Simon Templeton, and Lady Ysilla, representing her father and brother's interest, along with some other lords that she wasn't as familiar with. Taking a seat when Robin did, she allowed her cousin to take the lead and reached into her pocket to ready the letters. "My cousin and I are to be wed, this you know, and so I've agreed to this meeting at your request." Robin said, his voice firmer than she thought him capable of, unless he was in mid-tantrum. "We thank you, my lord, for the opportunity to speak. While I speak for all of us here, and am most pleased you've decided to wed, it is the choice of your bride that gives me and your lords pause." Lady Waynwood said. "You think my cousin unsuitable?" Robin said, angered. "Not in of herself, my lord. Lady Sansa is a fine lady, as all can see." Lord Belmore said with a nod. "However, there are problems that she brings that others do not," Lord Redfort said. "My prior husbands," she said, reaching out to calm Robin down a little. She'd stoke his anger later if needed. "Indeed, my lady," Lady Waynwood said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sansa almost had to force the tears to come, her mind going to those deep, dark places that she had done her utmost to lock away and hope to forget. She took out her handkerchief and wiped her face and noticed that only half those present showed her any sympathy in their looks. Sansa hoping to generate far more of it with her tale of woe. "When I was in King's Landing and at the mercy of Joffrey Waters, I suffered greatly. My lords, my lady, I was beaten, humiliated, and tormented. Each time my brother won a victory on the field was another day. I was to be punished for it. Whatever tales you've heard of Joffrey, don't do him justice. He was far crueler than any of you dare to imagine. I had hoped that when his grandfather reached the city, that things would change. That Lord Tywin, despite his reputation, would at least see the value in my safety and fair treatment. I was proved very wrong, and then I found that he himself had his own plans for me." She looked now to see one or two of the lords looking shamefaced. She'd known that Robin had raised the fact they'd not marched to rescue her, not once, but twice. That his mother was the reason for the first and he himself for the second. Not something she'd let him dwell on, and instead it was the honor of the Vale Lords that was called into question. "I was 3 and 10 when they married me to Tyrion Lannister, a scared and beaten child married to the imp, wed to the demon monkey. I feared more for what was to face me in my marriage bed than I did each time I was brought in front of Joffrey," she said, her tears falling once more. "And yet it turned out that despite it all, Tyrion at least had a shred of human decency." She took out the 2 letters, holding them in her hand as Lady Waynwood looked at them both with intrigue. "Lord Tyrion refused to lay with me, lest I wished it so. His decency, something I'd not expected, though, I very much appreciated. As you can imagine, it was never something I wished for. And so when Lord Baxley sold me to the Boltons, it was as a maiden I was sold. These letters offer proof of that. The first is from Lord Tyrion himself, confirming that we never consummated our marriage and agreeing to an annulment of it because of that fact. The second is from Maester Wolkin, who examined me at the Boltons' behest, It confirms that my maidenhead was still intact before I was forcibly married for the second time. She looked out on the lords who were looking to each other and to Lady Anya, who was standing up, ready to walk and take the letters from her hand. Sansa ready to add the final piece to her tale, and almost certain to its impact. Alas for me, Ramsay Bolton had no shred of decency, nor any such care for my wishes, and so my maidenhead was soon taken without my consent, she said as she began to cry openly. Later, sitting in the quiet corner of the garden, lunch finished, and a wedding date set, and a request to the faith sent and signed by the lords and ladies of the Vale, Sansa wished she could relax and reflect on a job well done, only to see that look on Robin's face and to know she could not. She moved closer to him and tried not to shake when his fingers closed on her breast, and she closed her eyes when his lips met her own. Sansa tried her utmost not to retch when he took her hand and placed it on his hardness, feeling the bile in her mouth as she gripped him through his breeches, and he shuddered when she rubbed him there. Only the quickness of his release offered her any respite. Winterfell 3:05 AC. Tyrion! He'd done his best to put aside his feelings about Jon Snow and had instead played the game. Tyrion had flattered when necessary. He'd offered sound advice when called for, and was now finally somewhat back in both their good graces. The Queen's smiles were directed at him once more, and filled his heart each time that she did so. Now he, the Queen's men, and some of the lords of the North had been called to a meeting by Daenerys and Jon Snow. The topic for that meeting clear for any with eyes to see. The Dothraki had begun to ready to leave, as had the Unsullied, and soon they would be saying goodbye to the cold North. All day Jon Snow had met with northern lords and ladies, while the Queen, Missandei, and Arya Stark had strolled around Winterfell as if they were saying goodbye. They were leaving, marching south, and he was being invited to share in the plans for the war to come. It had been what he'd been waiting for, what he wished for, and yet he was surprised that he'd been accepted back so soon. It was only when he reached the door and saw Sir Brian in her new white cloak that he truly understood why that was. Military tactics and preparing for war was Jon Snow's wheelhouse, preparing to rule, and for what came next was his. They needed him, not to win the throne, but to keep it, and so he was now being brought back into the inner circle. That it was not his hand or in any position was something that irked him. Still, but small steps were needed for now. Entering the room, he saw Jon Snow and Sir Davos, looking over a map with Jaime and Ser Jorah both close by. His brother was wearing his own white cloak and seemed to Tyrion to be guarding Jon Snow, while Ser Jorah, as always, was close by the Queen. Daenerys looked radiant. Her white fur coat was buttoned tightly, and her hair was done in an elaborate braid. Beside her, Yara Stark, Lady Maggie, Lyanna Mormont, and Missandei all seemed to be engaged in some conversation or other, and Tyrion was happy to see the Queen smile and nod when she saw him enter. He was about to walk over and speak to her when Jon Snow called them to the table, Daenerys walking straight to her husband's side, which Tyrion tried his best not to feel annoyed about. Hurrying over so he didn't miss anything. He was happy to see there were chairs for each of them to sit at, more so that his own had a cushion to place him of a height with the others. Tyrion surprised to see that it was Jon Snow who nodded at him when he took his seat, and so he nodded back at him as the meeting began. Cersei has 20,000 men of the Golden Company at her disposal, and according to Cersei Ame, at least another 10,000 of Lannister forces in and around King's Landing, with perhaps as many as another 20,000 in the west that she may call on once she knows we're on the march. The Iron Fleet has perhaps 10,000 or more men it can call on, though mainly at sea. Tyrion began to do the sums in his head and was just about to compare it with their own when Jon Snow began speaking again. We suffered far fewer losses than we could have during the battle against the army of the dead. Hornos still has over 90,000 men under his command, and Grey Worm almost 7,000. I intend to bring 2,000 Northmen with me too, giving us more than 100,000 men, compared to Cersei's 60,000, almost a 2-to-1 advantage, Jon said. Along with Drogon and Rhaegal, Daenerys said. Aye, along with Drogon and Rhaegal, Jon Snow said, bringing the Queen's hand to his lips. So few men of the North, your grace, Lady Mage said. Aye, my lady. As I told the Northern Lords earlier, had things been different, I'd have sought to bring more. But the North has both suffered the most over the course of the wars. The realm has faced, and its men are more needed in the North. Winter is coming, Jon Snow said. Winter is coming, your grace, Lady Meg said with a nod. When we reach White Harbor, Her Grace will send a representative along with ships provided by Lord Manderley to Meereen. Food and other essentials will be made available along with access to some of Her Grace's own reserves of gold and coin to see that the North is provided for to ensure it survives the upcoming winter. Jon said, and Tyrion looked at the surprised look on Lady Mage and her daughter's faces. I thank you, Your Grace, on behalf of the North. Lady Mage said to the Queen, The North named my husband their king and me their queen, my lady. It is our responsibility to see that it thrives, my lady. But Daenerys said with a smile, I know you'd no doubt join me if I asked Lady Maggie as would you, Lady Lyanna. However, the North is in need of its heroes, and I'll not take any away from it that are best needed here. Edison Tollitt has agreed to serve as my castellan here in Winterfell, and Lord Wyman has agreed to serve as our Lord Guardian of the North on a temporary basis. Her Grace and I would ask you to serve as its warden for now, also. Jon Snow said, and Lady Maggie looked from Jon Snow to the Queen before nodding. I'd be honored, Your Grace, Lady Meg said. I thank you, my lady. Perhaps you, Lord Wyman, and Lord Tollitt could discuss any further issues you may have before we leave. Jon Snow said. As dismissals go, it was a subtle but effective one, and soon the only Northman left in the room was Jon Snow, Tyrion wondering why that was, but saying nothing. He listened. Then, as Jon Snow explained his plan, the ship sailing to Dragonstone and he taking the Dothraki and Northmen through the Riverlands on foot, while Daenerys sailed with the fleet. That the Queen was not best pleased was clear for all to see, and yet, when Jon Snow turned to him to ask his opinion, Tyrion was torn. On one hand, were he to suggest that they all travel together, he'd no doubt receive more of the Queen's favor. On the other, this way allowed for more opportunities. In the end, it was that and the chance to be alone with the Queen and to blame what was to come on Jon Snow that won out. Your Grace, while I believe it perhaps for the best that we all travel together, I can see your reasoning here, and I find no fault with it. A two-pronged attack would be for the best. Her Grace coming by sea from Dragonstone, and you by land would force my sister to look to you both and cause confusion among her ranks. Tyrion said and saw the king nod and the queen glower at him. I thank you, Lord Tyrion, for your counsel. Perhaps it's for the best if you traveled with Her Grace in case more of it is needed. Jon Snow said, and he smiled as he nodded. As you wish, Your Grace. After the meeting was done, he hurried to the rookery and was glad to see that Wolkan wasn't there. The door was locked, but easy enough to open, and he quickly moved into the room, looking through the cages until he found the two that he wished for. Switching the two birds, he left the room and almost ran back to his own, quickly writing out the two notes and hiding one inside of the other before he sealed it with the three-headed dragon. He then calmly walked from his room and headed back to the Maester's, knocking at Wolkan's door rather than heading back to the rookery itself. Lord Tyrion? The Maester asked, surprised when he opened his door. Maester, I wish to send a raven to Dragonstone, Tyrion said, and the Maester looked at him oddly for a moment. For their graces, my lord? Wolkan asked. For their graces, master, he said, and Wolkan bid him join him as he walked up the stairs and into the rookery for the second time that day. He handed the master the sealed note and was pleased to see he didn't seem to pay it any mind, instead moving to the cage and taking the raven out. After attaching the scroll to its leg, Wolkan moved to the window, and within a moment the bird was in the air. Tyrion almost whistling at the simplicity of it all as he walked down the stairs and back into the courtyard. Seeing the Queen, Ser Jorah, and some guards walk his way, he felt his heart stop, but when he saw her smile, he knew it wasn't as he feared. I've sent a message to Dragonstone, Your Grace, to ready for our return, he said, explaining his visit to the Maester. Very good. From now on, these men are to act as your guards, Tyrion. You seem to have given much thought to your position while on the road. And to my husband's own, continue to prove yourself loyal to not just me, but to Jon as well, and perhaps there is a role on our council for you after all. I thank you, Your Grace, for the second chance, he said, with a smile. There won't be a third one, Tyrion, she before said, walking away from him. He slept well that night, knowing that Cersei would soon receive the raven. His words spoken to her when they'd met alone he hoped would be enough to prove them true. That he actually did care for her unborn babe was no lie, and that he wished she'd lived to see the babe born was one of the few good thoughts he had in relation to his sister. He'd told her so when they'd met, and it had been enough he'd thought to bring her to their side. That it had not was something that he should have realized. And yet he did not. He could only hope he wasn't making the same mistake this time, and that she'd act based on the information he was telling her. The fleet would be attacked, and Jon Snow would take the blame for it. Tyrion ready to tell the queen that her husband wished to rule and rule alone. After all, how else could they have known where they would be? The West 3005 AC. Daemon Lannister. He looked at the Raven scroll and shook his head. His cousin really was a fool if she thought an order from her carried any weight with the true men of the West. After what she'd done in the Sept of Baelor, they would never follow her again, as it was only respect for TARGERYAN had kept their allegiance in line. Even that was fleeting after the loss on the King's Road, but they had been prepared to follow him to the north and to fight this so-called army of the dead. Davin had not been and would have preferred to see the north burned to the ground than to see Westerman's blood spilled to protect it from any army, dead men or not. His feelings, he knew, were clouded by the loss of his father at Rickard Karstark's hands, and the fact he'd never gotten his vengeance against the Lord or the Northmen themselves. So he'd refused to go even despite Sir Yene and Sir Adam's request. And as Warden of the West, it had been up to him to refuse the others' leave to do so when Cersei's orders were to stay were made clear. Was it hypocritical of him to follow one order from a crazed woman and then to ignore another, perhaps? He knew, though, it was one thing not to wish to fight alongside men that you blamed for your father's death and another to fight against them, especially when those men also had dragons to call upon, so they could name him a hypocrite if they so wished. He cared not. Compared to some others who'd made decisions in the wars that had ravaged the West over the past few years, being a hypocrite wasn't actually all that bad. Looking at himself in the mirror, his long hair tamed and his beard trimmed, he looked every inch the Western Lord instead of the crazed and angered lion he'd looked for so many years. His sister finally getting through to him that while it was for a noble reason that he'd said he'd not cut his hair or beard, the reality of it shamed them in their father's memory. "You're a Lannister, Davin. One of the few that remain, and one of the only ones that are worth a damn. It's time you started to look like what you are, and not what they see," Serena said. He left the room and walked down the halls. Casterly Rock now back in the hands of the Lannisters after being abandoned first by them and then by the Unsullied who'd taken an empty keep. A cunning plan that Jaime had come up with, though, were it left to him, he'd have broken the Unsullied against its walls. Still, they were back, and as he strolled down to the Great Hall, he readied for the meeting ahead. His own decision was made, and as Warden, it carried the might of the role he served in. But he was no Tywin Lannister, and so on this, they'd make their own choices too. Entering the hall, he looked to the high table. Lady Jaina Sarban, his mother and sisters, the last remnants of House Lannister apart from Joy Hill. Should Lady Jaina pass, she would be the new Lady of Casterly Rock, and it was she who Daemon was being pressured to take to wife. That the girl had all the beauty that the Lannisters were known for and was next in line to the Rock itself was enough for most men, but not for him. He wished his wife to love him and wished to be his, and he feared had or would never see him that way. Taking his seat, he looked out on the Lords of the West and nodded to Jaina to begin. "We've received a raven from her grace, ordering the West to rise. She demands her warden. My cousin, call the banners and bring them to bear on the force that the bastard and the Dragon bitch now march her way." Jenny said, and Daemon chuckled. He'd wondered if she'd use those terms, and he had wagered that she would. "And what does our warden say?" "Sir," Adam called out. Daemon looked on as the other lords and knights stared his way, their eyes focused on him as they awaited his reply. "My cousin is our queen, and it's our sworn oath to come when she calls," he said, reaching out and taking a swallow of his drink. "But there are men here in this room who marched along the King's Road, men who faced a dragon's wrath once before. Were that the only thing that gave me pause, then I'd name myself a craven and think my courage to be faltering. But it's not. It's the nature of the Queen herself that gives me reason to doubt our oath," he said. "You say we should not march?" Lord Danefort asked. "That we should refuse our rightful queen?" Lord Crackall asked, and Davin glared at the man. Desmond was not one who'd answer any call, good or true. The man as craven as the day was long. "I'm saying that I have reason to doubt whether the call from this queen is in the best interests of the West. My lords, we all know what happened in the Sept of Baelor. Do we really wish to march and risk such a thing happening to us? Lies. Lies. It was the imp. If there is a man fool enough here to believe Tyrion responsible, then I fear for him and his house. My nephew may be a monster, a kinslayer who is cursed by the gods, but my niece is just as guilty of the very same crime. It wasn't Tyrion who destroyed the Great Sept, no, my lords. That was all Cersei's work, and among the many she sent to their death, Day was mine own brother, her uncle Kevin. Gina said, and the voices calmed. We are faced with a choice, my lords. We march and face an army thrice our size, and with dragons at its head, to protect a woman who killed her kin, and would no doubt see each and every one of us dead for one more day on the throne. Or we stand down and we wait this out, Davin said loudly. And should the Dragon Queen win? Sir and Adam asked. Then we kneel and pledge fealty, Adam. We've not risen against her, and she'll need a pliant Westerlands, will she not? Davin asked. And should Cersei? Desmond asked. Then perhaps it's time for someone else to hold the crown, he said as men turned to each other and the decision was made. A few hours later, he stood in the Golden Gallery and heard the footsteps behind him. Davin turning when he smelt her perfume. Sir Davin, Joy said with a smile. Lady Joy, he replied. Are you really seeking a crown? Joy asked, standing beside him as he looked at the gilded ornaments and tapestries that lined the walls. No, there will be only one winner in the war to come, and one person wearing a crown. The Dragon Queen, she asked nervously. Aye, the Dragon Queen, he said, turning to her. They stood in silence for a moment, and he took in just how truly beautiful she was. 7 and 10 years old, and a woman grown. Her green eyes and long blonde hair made her Cersei's twin. Was Cersei not mad and bitter? She caught him looking and smiled, and when he went to turn away, he found her hands stopping his head from doing so. You know my aunt wishes us wed, Sir Davin, she asked, and he nodded. It is something you wish for, too. I wouldn't presume, my lady, he said softly. And were it something that I wished for, she asked, surprising him. I did not expect you may feel that way. I believe in time that you and I could fall for each other. Sir Davin, I know the politics and why my aunt wishes the match, and that the West needs it too. I believe we could be happy together, Joy said with a smile. I would try to make you happy, my lady, he said, returning her smile. Then I have but one request of you, sir, she said, and he nodded. Treat with Daenerys Targaryen before she faces Cersei. Meet with her and offer our fealty before the fight to come. You ask too much, my lady, he said, shaking his head. I do not, sir. The words you said in there were good and true, but you made one mistake in your thinking, Joy said. Which was? He asked curiously. While the Queen may require a pliant West, it doesn't have to be one that we're a part of. Sir Davin, we're Lannisters, and she may seek to punish us just for that. Staying out of the war to come isn't enough. We must offer our swords so that she knows us to be true. The West would never go for it, he said, looking into her green eyes. It doesn't truly need to see her. A large enough force of men you can trust, riding out to treat and meeting the Queen under parley. Remember what Cyrodiil said about the terms that she offered. Rhaenys Tarly, and he fought against not with her. Make the offer, Cyrodiil, and I'll give you my hand and my heart. Joy said, leaning in and kissing his cheek before walking from the Golden Gallery. Davin stood there for a few more minutes alone before he turned and walked through the doors, his mind made up and his course set, and he only hoped that he was making the right choice. Winterfell, White Harbor 305 AC. Aegon. He placed the blue winter rose in her hand and said his goodbye, and then walked from the crypt and out into the courtyard. Zed looked at him nervously and yet was resolute, and Aegon felt he'd made the right decision to name him as Castellan. Though he didn't have the true experience to run Winterfell, he left enough men around him who did, and yet it was the fact that he knew he could completely trust him that had made the choice so simple. After embracing him and telling him that he'd try and not make it too long until he was relieved and laughing when Ed said, at least there wasn't a wall for him to bring down around him, he said his goodbyes and moved on to the others that he needed to say them to. Tormund stood with the Mormonts, and after saying goodbye to Maggie, a quick and easier one than the one he was now having with Lyanna, he looked and knew that Tormund would be harder still. You told me once that winter is here, and we need the king in the north. In the north, he said, looking to Lyanna. Aye, did your grace, she replied. You'll not say so again? He asked with a smile. Your grace has seen the army of the dead defeated. He's made plans to see the north fed for winter, and has placed capable people to see the north is made ready while he is away, Lyanna said, looking to him. I have faith in my king, your grace. When the north needs him, he will return, and until that day he shall be missed. I thank you, Lady Lyanna, for that faith and for everything else you've given me without my asking, he said, and received a nod in return as he moved to Tormund. The hug he was enveloped in was bone-crushing, Tormund lifting him from his feet and Aegon barely able to wrap his arms around the man in return. When he eventually relaxed his grip and put him back to the ground, Aegon looked through his glassy and wet eyes to see Tormund's were tear-filled too. "I don't have the words, Tormund," he said softly. "Nor I, Jon Snow, nor I. All I know to say is that it has been the privilege of my entire life to name you my friend, to fight alongside you, and to drink, laugh, and cry with you. Thank you, Tormund. Thank you for all of it," he said as Tormund's tears fell from his eyes. Aegon looked on as Tormund nodded, and around the yard, every single one of the free folk knelt as one, Tormund doing likewise. "The king beyond the wall," Tormund shouted loudly. "The king beyond the wall." The voices rang around as Aegon turned and walked to his horse. He looked back as the horses rode out the gate. Tormund stood speaking to Lyanna and Maggie Mormont, Ed looking at him before turning away, and every eye he could see in Winterfell was watching as he rode away. Perhaps never to return. Dany rode close by him, and Signy and TARGERIYAN on either side, while Ghost raced on ahead. Aegon felt he'd done right by the North. He'd named Lord Wyman as Lord Guardian, basically the political might of the North, while Maggie was the military might. Ed was to keep Winterfell until he knew what could actually be done with it. Dany would see the North fed, and he'd left them as many capable men as he could. He felt he'd done right by it. He believed he had. When they reached Wintertown, he was pleased to see the men and women had come out to wave them off. More so to hear them cheer Dane's name as loudly as they did his own. That his wife appreciated it, only making him feel proud of his people for finally showing her the true North. When the little girl came running towards his horse, he saw Jaime and Brienne look nervous, and he shook his head to reach down and muss the girl's hair. Only for a note to be placed in his hand, Aegon reading it as he rode and then showing it to Dany, who read it and looked his way before nodding. A few miles outside of Wintertown they stopped, Aegon calling Sir Davos and the Dragon Guard and telling them what he and Dany were about to do, leaving them with orders for them to continue the march. It took less than an hour for Rigod and Drogon to land, and as he and Dany walked to the dragons, Arya joined him, wondering where they were flying off to. "Jon?" his little sister asked as she caught up to him. "We need to go to White Harbor. Lord Varys has news of great import to share." "Can it not wait?" Arya asked, and he shook his head. "Can I come with you?" "Not this time. I promise I'll take you up again when I return," he said, and she nodded. "How long?" "A day, maybe two. It won't be longer than that," he said, and she nodded before he grabbed her and kissed her forehead. Arya making an annoyed face, and yet he saw the smirk before it went away. "Look after Missandei and the others." I will," she said, as she then walked over to say goodbye to Dainty. After speaking briefly to Roziel and telling him of their plans with the Ironborn and feeling his eagerness to see them done, he climbed onto the dragon's back. Dimoning likewise withdraws him, and soon enough they were both in the air. It was nightfall when they reached White Harbor, and they landed close enough to the gates that they would be seen to be who they were. The guards only coming their way once the dragons were back in the sky. It took some time to get to the new castle. Night, though, it was people had seen the dragons, and so they were stopped many times along the way. Men, women, and children were eager to see the king and queen, and Aegon thinking it again a far different reception than the one Dany had received just moons earlier. Lady Willa waited them and told them she'd see a room ready for them and that Varys was inside. The girl asking about her grandfather and relieved to know that she'd see him soon enough. They were no sooner in their room than Varys came to them. The look on his face, one that made Aegon most eager for his news. "It's good to see both of you so well, your graces," Varys said, smiling as he took a seat. "You too, Lord Varys. Your note said you had news to share," he said, and Varys nodded eagerly. "Lord Jon Connington and a large portion of the Golden Company are yours. Your grace, perhaps even all of it," Varys said, and Aegon looked to Dany to see that she was as shocked as he. "For true, Lord Vigras?" Dany asked. "For true, your grace, there may be a price, some lands and some honors. But the realm is in need of new lords, and Lord Connington, I believe, will make the deal fair." "He accepted the truth?" Aegon asked. "Most happily, your grace," Varys said. "And we trust his word?" Dany asked. "When it comes to Aegon, yes, your grace, knowing that you two are wed even more so," Varys said, and Dany smiled. "That's not the only good news, your grace, from Lord Hightower." Varys said, handing him a letter. He read it quickly, his smile becoming ever more full as he did so, and Dany looking at him eagerly, only his frown at the end causing her own to appear. "Aegon?" she asked worriedly. "We have the reach, my love," he said, trying to smile. "Yet you seem displeased." Dany asked, reaching out her hand to ask for the note. "It seems they know of me and of our wedding, Dany," he said, handing her it. It took some time for her to read it, and once she did, she looked to Varys, as did he. The Master of Whisperers not seeming as concerned as either of them was. "Saudelaire told me his sister knows things. I believe she's a greenseer, your grace. As for your wedding news has no doubt reached throughout the realm by now," Varys said. "Aye, but it's yet more people who know the truth of me," he said worriedly. "Perhaps it's time we use that to our advantage, Aegon," Dane said. "It's too dangerous, Dany," he said, and Dany shook his head. "Is it? We have the North, the Reach, Dorne, and the Riverlands. The other loyalists' houses will swear to us now, too. We're married, Aegon. We're together. I say we name you as true and that we are wed and seek to rule together." Dany said, "You have the Riverlands, Dorne?" Varys asked, surprised, before Dany explained it to him, and then about the North. Aegon sitting and trying to think if he should or should not do as Dany suggested. "Lord Varys," he asked, "I believe her grace is right. I'd speak to Lord Wyman first. Let him know this truth. But once you've done so, then I'd send word to the rest of the realm. Your grace, name it as true." He got up and walked to the fire, Aegon looking down into the flames, and was soon joined by his wife, Dany, taking his hand and leaning in close to him as he looked to her. "We are together, Aegon, you, I, and our babe. We have our army, our dragons. The Reach knows the truth, and the North, I believe, will accept it too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And the Riverlands," Dorne, the others, "will kneel or be brought to their knees. We are dragons, my love. It's time the realm knows the dragons have truly returned. They can live in our new world, or die in their old one," he said as she smiled, and he leaned down to kiss her. Aegon finally seeing the words for what they were, truth. The next 305 AC. Does Aegon? Varys had stayed behind to send out the ravens, Aegon and Dany taking their time to decide just what words they would say. He'd thought about not sending them, where to send them from and to, and what to put in them, and while he'd come to a decision, he wasn't completely convinced it was the right one. The truth without, he knew, too many people already knew for it not to, but he had hoped that Dany would be sitting on the Iron Throne by then. Still, it was perhaps for the best if they took control of the situation and announced it themselves, lest anyone decided to use their silence as well as the truth against them. Sending the ravens from White Harbor was the best choice. If they must do this, then best it was done quickly. And after White Harbor, it wouldn't be until Dragonstone or King's Landing itself that they'd get another chance. So after agreeing to catch up with them on the road, Varys had wished them well, and they'd taken to the air. Now looking down on their army and seeing Moat Cailin in the distance, Aegon pointed to it, and Dany nodded as she brought Drogon in to land. After speaking to Rhaegal and telling him to rest and eat, he took Dany's hand and walked into the keep. The scars of battle had never truly been repaired in the moat. They'd simply not had the time or inclination, and Aegon could almost see the stains of the squids still on the walls. It would be something that he'd see coin provided for in the future. As the moat went, so did the North, and the North wouldn't fall again. Of that he'd make certain. Looking to Dany, he could see she was unimpressed. And he smiled at that. His wife had seen the greatest buildings in the known world after all. From the walls of court to the pyramids of Meereen, not to mention Dragonstone and even Winterfell itself. Moat Cailin in its present state was poor in comparison, and yet it truly was more important than almost any other keep in Westeros, and certainly any other in the north. For thousands of years the moat held the south at bay. Armies came and were broken against its walls, and their bodies littered the ground around us. Aegon said as the guards ran their way. "It seems so," Dany said before he interrupted. "Aye, it does. When we sit our throne, we'll rebuild it, and many others, Dany. This is our kingdom, and we'll see it strong," he said. Your grace," the guard said breathlessly before Dany could speak, his wife immediately standing a little stiffer and Jerevan trying to stifle a laugh as he watched her becoming Daenerys the queen, and not Dany his wife. "Our army marches this way, and we'll stay here for the night. Have a room prepared," he said, as the guard looked at him worriedly. Your Grace, the rooms here are poor and ill-suited for a king or queen, the guard said. My wife and I are used to hardship as well as luxury. I think for now, just a warm, dry room will suffice, he said, smiling at the man who looked relieved as he nodded and ran off to do as he was bid. Aegon offered his wife his arm, which she took, and they began to walk around the moat itself. The children's tower, the gatehouse, and the drunkards, all standing still and all in dire need of repair. As they walked, he found that he couldn't help but think of his brother and what Robb must have felt when he too marched south and stayed in the moat. He was soon to have some sense of that, as when the guard date back, they were taken to the children's tower, and he knew just by entering the room that Robb had stayed here too. They were brought some warm food and thought it wasn't particularly appetizing. It was at least something to fill Dany's belly. Aegon laughing as while he picked and prodded at what he could only say resembled a stew of some sort. Dany wolfed it down, his wife looking at him, annoyed when she saw the smirk on his face. My wife is a hungry dragon once more, it seems, he said with a chuckle that soon turned into a full belly laugh as Dany reached over and took his bowl from him before quickly finishing what he had not. He got up from his seat and checked the bed before walking over to the fire and placing another log in it, Dane Shun joining him when he moved 2 seats close to it. Wyman, Aegon, do you fear his reaction? Dany asked. Despite him not rising for me when I marched against Ramsay, he and his house have always been loyal and even. His reluctance to march with me I can understand, he began, Dany interrupting him before he could continue. Why didn't he rise, she asked. Wyman lost a lot in the war. His son and heir was slain at the Red Wedding, and he also watched as my brother's best friend betrayed him and took the North. He saw the Boltons rise, and no one other than those who joined me was willing to stand against them. On the night they crowned me and Lyanna Mormont shamed them all. He stood up and said he didn't commit men to my cause because he didn't want more Manderleys dying for nothing, Aegon said. It wasn't for nothing, Yakon. It was for you, Dany said, determinedly. I know, but who was I but a fool who knew nothing, he said with a smile before waving Dainty off before she could stand up for him. He was right not to follow Jon Snow, Dainty. That man was a fool who allowed himself get played, and because of that, lost far too many good men. No, I've no worries about Wyman following me, following us, because Jon Snow is dead and Aegon Targaryen sits here in his stead. Only a fool will dare stand against House Targaryen, my love, and Wyman is anything but a fool, he said, reaching out and taking her hand in his. They made love passionately and loudly given the looks they got the next morning when they broke their fast. Aegon amazed at the difference in how he now accepted those looks. Tormund and Ygritte had often called him out for his prudishness when it came to speaking about sex. Both of them took great delight in trying to make him blush and succeeding more than once. Dany too had made comment on it, even if he was far different than the boy he'd once been. It had at first still being something easily able to embarrass him. Being with her, though, laying with his wife and seeing her own carefree attitude towards people, knowing that they brought each other such pleasure, it must be rubbing off on him, he thought with a smirk. Aegon sitting at the table with no hint of a blush on his cheeks, and, in fact, finding that he almost welcomed the looks he received. My husband seems amused, Dany asked as he placed her food on the table in front of her. My wife has corrupted me, he said with a smirk. Have I indeed? She asked, her eyebrow raised. You have, though not a maid. I still blushed and acted as one, and yet I find I care not what people think of our coupling, he said to a giggle. Why, Jon Snow, what have you done with my prudish northern wolf? Dane said, giggling still, as he moved beside her close enough so he could whisper in her ear. Replaced him with a dragon, my love, he said as he nibbled on her ear, her giggles now turning into laughs. Only a dragon can love a dragon, she said, looking at him, before kissing his lips. They were eating their meals when they arrived. Ser Jabras, Jaime, and Brienne, Arya, and Gendry, Tyrion, Missandei, and Grey Worm, and Lord Wyman, all hurrying their way. Aegon sighing, knowing the time was now upon them to tell some truths, and he turned to see Dany staring at Tyrion, and then at the 2 Dornishmen who entered last of all. Your Grace, all is well? Tyrion asked. It is Lord Tyrion, Dany said. There is much we must discuss, so perhaps it's for the best if we stay here one more night, he said, looking to his wife, who seemed to relish the idea. Lord Wyman, once you're settled, His Grace, and I would like a word, Jane said. Your Grace, Wyman replied. The bow he made a quick one as he turned to go and get settled in. Before he had a chance to say anything, he saw Mira Reed walk into the hall, Aegon rising to his feet and moving to the girl. "Lady Reed," he said softly. "Your Grace, it's true, my father?" she asked, and he nodded. "I'm afraid so, my lady. You have my deepest sympathy." "His body, he needs to be brought back to Greywater Watch," she said, holding her emotions in. "Is with your men, my lady. Your father was a brave man, Lady Reed, and though nothing I can say to you will make up for his loss, I am here today, partly because of him. The North survives because of men like your father, and the North remembers my lady. If there is anything I can ever do for you or your house, I thank you, your Grace. But House Stark has cost my house greatly over the years. For now, I'd just like to take my father home," she said, her voice sad and tinged with a bit of anger, which he could understand and accept. "Of course, my lady. Sir Brienne, would you take Lady Reed to her men?" he said before turning back, and Brienne moved quickly to escort the lady to her men and her father. Aegon walking back to the table and taking his seat, his appetite gone for now. After Dany had finished eating and the rest of them were settled, Aegon sent for Lord Wyman and had him meet them at the weirwood that grew amongst the ruins of one of the towers. It was old, gnarled, and its roots had grown through the broken walls of the tower itself. Aegon placed Sir Jorah, Sir Brienne, Sir Jaime, and Grey Worm all on guard so they'd not be interrupted, while Ghost prowled around the walls themselves, the White Wolf having feasted on a lizard lion who'd come too close to the surface. "Your Grace, your Grace," Wyman said as he walked towards them. "Lord Wyman," Dany said, "I asked you to meet us here, Lord Wyman, both so you'd know that the words I speak are the truth and that I remain as always a son of the North," Aegon said. "Your Grace," Wyman asked, confused. "I know no other way to say it, but to say it, so forgive me my bluntness, my lord." "My father was not Ned Stark," Aegon said, and Wyman smiled. "I never thought he was your Grace. It never made sense to me why he'd not speak of your mother if he was your father, your Brandon's boy," Wyman said with the smile of a man who'd just had a truth he'd long suspected, confirmed. "No, my lord, I'm not. My father was Rhaegar Targaryen, my mother, his wife Lyanna Targaryen," Aegon said, handing the Lord of White Harbor the papers that proved it true. He watched him carefully as he read the words, Wyman looking at them and nodding, then looking to him almost as if he was seeing him for the first time. "This changes things, your Grace," Wyman said. "I know. My wife and I will take the Iron Throne, my lord. Together we will rule, and Westeros will be at peace once more. You named me king in the North based on blood, and that blood still runs through my veins, though from my mother and not my father. You have a choice before you, as does the North. Support me and know that a son of the North sits the Iron Throne. A son who cares for the North more than any king who came before me, or reject me and name another and accept all that action would lead to." Aegon said, looking at the Lord, who chuckled, catching him by surprise. "We unnamed you once, your Grace. The folly of that was soon shown to us all. You and her Grace together beat back the greatest threat the North has ever faced. You've made arrangements to see us fed, and wolf's blood flows through your veins just as much as dragons does." He looked on as Wyman bent down to one knee, Dany looking to him and smiling as Aegon turned to look back to the man in front of him. "I knelt to the man I believed to be the son of a Stark. I kneel to him still, the king in the North," Wyman said as Aegon bid him rise. Once he had, Aegon told him of their plans and that the rest of the realm would be told by now that the Ravens had already left from White Harbor. But he'd wished to speak to him personally. Wyman advised they send a letter to Meg and Lyanna Mormont, and that he would see to the rest of the North. The Lord saying that while some would grumble, all would kneel. "That went better than I had expected," Diane said. "It did. As of now, the realm probably knows the truth. I think it's time we told Tyrion and the others who don't know," Aegon said. "This is going to be fun." Yakon, Diane said as Yakon rolled his eyes and made her laugh. The two of them walking from the weirwood tree and back into the yard. King's Landing 3005 AC. Cersei. She felt the pain when he pulled her hair, the stretching of her neck as she tried to get away from him, and then she was falling. It took her some time to get her breath back. Cersei needing Euron to hand her the wine, so intense had her release been. No one other than Jaime had ever made her feel this way, and she'd never expected anyone else would be able to. Her connection with her brother was far different than she had with any other man, and that was what she had put down. How he made her feel, too, was this love. Was that how you knew? She pondered on this as she got her breath back and drank her wine. Beside her, Euron seemed just as worn out as she. Cersei smiling that she brought him as much pleasure as he did her. It was to her another sign of the difference between him and any other man, apart from Jaime. Over the years, she'd taken many people into her bed, men and women alike, and all to simply bring her pleasure. She'd found her release each and every time. With some, she'd almost forced them to bring her to it. Few, if any, had she ever sought to do the same for, and yet now she found she cared whether or not he felt it too. She wished him to feel it, to know that she made him lose himself, and that he couldn't get enough of what was between her legs. To be the only one between them to feel that way would be to give him far too much power over her, and that was not something she could allow. "You look tired, my love," she said, pouring herself another glass. "You've worn me out. Never have I tasted cunt such as yours," Euron said, and Cersei felt her heart race. "Nor have I been pleased by a cock such as this," she said, reaching out her hand to wrap it around his semi-hard length. "Good," he said, laughing. "For any man whose cock pleased you better would soon be looking for a place amongst the unsullied." It both excited her and worried her a little hearing him say such a thing. Though she'd sent Bronn to kill the imp and her brother, she never truly believed him capable of killing Jaime. Besides, it wasn't even something she truly wished for and was more a way to force him back to her side. Euron, however, could perhaps manage to do so, and so for now, at least, she held her tongue. She'd rather concentrate on other things anyway. "Do you believe the Raven?" she asked, and Euron nodded. "Aye, they'll need to sail to Dragonstone first anyway, especially if the Northern Bastard is marching with the rest of the men," Euron said. "Why?" she asked. "They'll want to coordinate their attacks, send their ships against us along with the dragons, while the North and the rest of the forces attack us from the other side. Just like a cavalry charge uses a double envelopment, they'll wish to attack us from both sides." "And us?" she asked. A little worriedly. "We'll be waiting for them," he said with a loud laugh. "I don't understand. They need to sail by Claw Isle, but they won't sail on the eastern side of it, as the dragons will want to keep near land. So to get to Dragonstone, they'll have to sail down along Crackclaw Point. It's small and narrow, and I'll be waiting for them there," Euron said. Cersei giggling as he drew it out on her stomach, his fingers almost but not quite going between her legs. She was about to tell him to do just that, her own fingers reaching out to grab his cock once more when the knock came at her door. Cersei looking to it with a look that promised whoever had dared to disturb them would suffer. Were this not important? That Euron didn't cover up his nakedness when Bernadette came in made her smirk. That the girl stared only at her naked body may very well have saved her head. "Your Grace, Grandmaster Cridburn requests a meeting. He says it's most urgent." Bernadette said, "Now?" she asked, annoyed. "He says your Grace would wish to be informed of his news. He's received a raven. Your Grace." She told Bernadette to ready her clothes and had to push Euron's hands away when he grabbed her. Cersei smiling when he did so, and when she saw his cock had hardened fully, as much as she wished for nothing more than to just have him take her, wherever he wished. She felt an almost need to know what it was. Qhorbran had learned, had her man in the Vale done the deed so soon? Was the Stark Whore dead? Had the Dark Star somehow managed to take the dragon bitch or the bastard wolf? Was one or both of them dead? She found her need to find out far outweighed the ache between her legs for once. So as she moved away from him and saw his anger flare and felt the rush of wetness it brought to her core, she dropped submissively to the floor and licked her lips, her meaning clear and taken as he moved towards her. She could still taste him in her mouth later as she walked to her solar. Euron lay resting in her bed, and Cersei tried not to be upset that his seed was wasted in her mouth, instead of where it should have been. The idea of birthing a babe of his was one that filled her with a sense of intrigue and excitement. Entering her solar, she found Qhorbran was already waiting for her, the expression on his face as hard to read as always. "Your Grace," he said with a nod. "The message?" she asked, holding her hand out. Sitting down at the desk, she unrolled the scroll and read it, her eyes widening as she did so. She couldn't even remember reaching for the wine or pouring it into her glass. Nor did she taste it as she drank it all down in one swallow, her hands shaking as she poured another and read it one more time. "To the Lord and Ladies of Westeros, I write to you to reveal a great truth that was kept hidden for 24 years. I name the man known as Jon Snow for who he truly is. Not a bastard or son of Lord Eddard Stark, as the realm was led to believe, but as Aegon Targaryen, the true-born son of Rhaegar and Lyanna Targaryen, and the true heir to the Iron Throne. Together with his wife, Daenerys, they call upon every man and woman who were loyal to their family to stand with them once more. The time has come to remove false lions from the throne they stole, to see the true king and queen crowned, and for the dragons to rule once more. The realm and its people have suffered under false kings and queens for far too long, and just as their graces have beaten the army of dead men that sought our end, they'll do so to any who stand against them. Stand with them, my lords, my ladies, stand with them and see the realm thrive once more. Lord Varys, Master of Whispers to their graces, King Aegon and Queen Daenerys of the House Targaryen. She looked to Qyburn, who was watching her intently, Cersei quickly drinking down the second glass of wine. Is this some jape, some jest? She asked, holding up the scroll. No, your grace. I believe the words to be true. We all wondered about Prince Rhaeke and Lyanna Stark. As for Lord Eddard, it was most odd that he of all people fathered a bastard, was it not? Qyburn said, Lies, lies, this is all lies. He never cared for the Stark slut. Never, do you hear me? Never, she said, screaming, the last bit out as loudly as she could. Qyburn simply stood there and said nothing, her hand allowing her to calm herself, and when she did, she turned to him and smiled. Send out our own ravens. Have them declare Jon Snow as the bastard that he is. Say that he and Varys, along with the dragon bitch, have concocted this mummery, knowing full well that the realm would never accept a bastard for a consort, she said, and Qyburn nodded. At once, your grace. She waited until he was out of the room, and once he was, she screamed loudly, once more, her hands hitting the desk hard as she crumpled the note up. He was to be mine. Father promised him to me. She stole him, bewitched him. That whore took what was hers. She'd have given him a true son, a son that looked like a dragon, not some mongrel wolf who claimed to be one. Yet, despite her anger, her tears feel freely, Cersei cursing Lyanna Stark for yet another thing that she stole from her. Memories of her wedding night flashing before her eyes, and Robert's voice sounding close enough as if he was still rutting on top of her. Lyanna, the realm reacts 30,005 AC. Dorn, Arianne. She had read The Raven from Ned Dane, and while she appreciated the fact that the Queen had accepted her proposal and fealty, she wondered what had gotten into the man to write the rest of it. Jon Snow marrying Daenerys had been a shock to her, but in hindsight, it made sense. Dorn had never cared for what side of the sheet someone was born on, and he was a king. After all, he brought the North and perhaps even the Riverlands, and the Vale too. By all accounts, he was handsome and very accomplished with his sword. Even Daemon saying he'd heard tell that he was the best swordsman in all the realm. So Daenerys being married to the man was really no true surprise. Logically, she doubted there was a better choice anywhere in the realm. While she may have pushed for someone, even perhaps Nad Dane, to be king consort, it was not something she could have demanded. But these words about an army of dead men in a great battle, even despite the tales she'd heard of the meeting in the dragon pit, these words were surely some jape. Arianne had put it out of her mind and concentrated instead on readying her forces for the inevitable call in March when they were asked to. She and Daemon had poured over routes, by land, by sea. Arianne favoring the former, while Euron Greyjoy still held most of his fleet. They decided that Daemon would lead their forces, and while she'd have wished to march with them, she knew she could not. Durin had been without their princess for far too long. She'd traveled to King's Landing to swear her fealty in person, but would not leave her home otherwise for a very long time. The wait for the order to march took some time, Arianne eventually asking Daemon to form up their men and make them ready to meet them on the road. She was doing her very best to get ahead of the game, and so that Dornish spears would taste both lion and kraken blood. As Bella had already marched with some of her own men, her cousins most eager for their own taste of revenge. Arianne worrying and yet not, as she knew how capable they truly were. She was going over some papers at her desk when the second raven arrived, Arianne quickly sending for Daemon as soon as she read it. Read, she said, handing it to him. They march? He asked. Read, she said. She saw his expression change as he read it. Arianne already knew it was true, and Sorella had confirmed the timing matched up, though she'd not needed her to. This changed things, and she knew not how. A bastard Stark was easy to support, a true-born son, though shamed her aunt far more. And Arianne wasn't sure if Dorne would rise for such a man. She wasn't sure if she could either, and yet she knew she must. "What do we do?" Daemon asked. "We march. I'm coming with you," she said, rising to her feet. "All right." "Not today, Daemon. Today I am Princess Arianne Nymeros Martell, and it is she who orders you to take her to meet this Aegon Targaryen." "As my princess orders," Daemon said. Storm's End. Edric Storm. Taking back his home was far easier than he had hoped, as the Lannister lickspittle was no true soldier, and Edric had raised the entire Stormlands to his side. They'd almost 10,000 Stormlanders to go with his own men by the time he reached the gates of Storm's End. Edric finding Caspar to be right, the Stormlands wished him to be their lord, which in turn would lead him right to the Iron Throne. Once he'd seen the Lannisters assembled and had met them under a flag of parley, Edric had known this would be no true fight. The man was not his uncle, and would not withstand a long siege. The forces he had at his call, not men who would wish to fight either, other than the walls of the keep itself. This man was already done for, but Edric knew he'd lose many men should he try and take those walls, so instead he used the same route that he'd escaped from, ordering the men assembled and leading them through the tunnels himself. Despite his cousin's protestations, the fight itself was just as pitiful as he'd expected, the men surrendering once they knew the walls had been breached. Edric had welcomed the cheers and the looks on the Stormlords' faces when he'd opened the gates of Storm's End to let them enter. At the feast to celebrate his victory, he'd told them all what he planned to do. Some disagreeing with him about Daenerys, but more of them warming to the idea of another Baratheon king. Later he'd heard tales of dead men rising, of a war to be fought in the north, and then of a victory in that war, something that he found hard to believe. That dead men rose to fight again was hard enough to accept. That an army of them marched and had already been defeated made no sense. It was something he knew he'd need to find out more about, though, as if his future bride claimed to have fought these men, then it would do no good for him to deny her. "My lord, a raven from the north," the master said. Edric took it, looking at it excitedly once he saw the three-headed dragon seal. Opening it, he read through it quickly. His hopes that she'd heard of him and had decided to make the first move and reach out were quickly dashed by the words he read. "Fuck," he said. "Fuck." The sound as he shouted the second word brought Andrew and Gerald into the room, Edric pacing up and down with the note still held in his hand. "My lord?" Andrew asked. "They're married," he said, expressing the first thought that came to his head. "She married the bastard?" Ser Gerald asked. "He's not a bastard, Ser Gerald, apparently. Eddard Stark fooled us all. Jon Snow isn't his son. He's the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, the true-born son, which means he's now the fucking king of the Seven Kingdoms." "The Stormlands won't," Andrew began. "Support him? What fucking choice do we have? If we don't, then we'll be fighting fucking dragons, and I'll not see Storm's End turned into another Harrenhal." "Then what are we to do?" Siergard asked. "I don't know," he said, slumping in his seat, laughing bitterly at the idea that a bastard had taken his queen and his throne, and finding the irony that he was not a bastard was something that he saw no humor in. The Vale 305 AC. Sansa. It had been a few days ago now, but she felt her meeting with the Septon had gone well, though the man himself was only really a conduit to the rest of the faith. Sansa had him send the letter to the conclave in Old Town, and she was certain that she'd receive the answer she wished for. That the man himself seemed so very eager for her to get the annulment, she could only put down to something she had counted on, the North. Not that it would actually even be possible for the faith to gain a foothold there, even was she named as its lady. Still, the mere possibility that they could finally gain a foothold into the North was enough to give her a path. That she had the backing of the Lord of the Vale in making her request, along with a threat from Robin to marry her regardless, only helped her case. Since they'd spoken to the Lords of the Vale, she had noticed a change, and she now got more and more deference, and even more people wished to be her friend. Something she welcomed, as though she trusted in only herself. Having friends would be far more beneficial than making enemies this early in her time here. She walked through the keep and out into the gardens, the chill in the air, actually something she welcomed as she did, the crisp, clean smell of the winter blooms. While because of the weather they stayed mostly inside the keep and Robin himself rarely left the warmth of its interior, she had missed being outside. It had become something over time that she welcomed. The freedom to walk outside and know that the guards that walked with her did so to protect and not to keep her prisoner. After spending some time just enjoying the fresh air, she turned to head back into the keep, Sansa deciding to go pray the Sept just as she had since she'd arrived here. Over the years, she'd pretty much lost her faith in the gods and their servants. None had come to her aid, after all, and praying to the Seven hadn't stopped her torment. But be that as it may, Sansa knew that appearance mattered, and to all who looked at her she must look a devoted and pious woman. Bidding her guards wait, she walked into the small sept, and was soon lighting a candle to the mother and maiden before she took to her knees and began to pray. This part of the act was true at last. Sansa did actually offer up prayers, and though she doubted anyone listened, she hoped they did. Sansa asked the gods to bring down all those who had sought her ruin. Cersei Lannister, Daenerys Targaryen, Jon Snow, all of them she'd see fall while she rose. She was in the middle of thinking about what it would be like to be the last one standing when she heard the footsteps behind her. She quickly rose to her feet and turned to see an ugly man moving her way. The knife in his hands was large, and the look in his eyes one she recognized all too well. Ramsay had often had that very same look, and it had only ever led to one thing: pain. "The Queen sends her regards," the man said, smiling, his rotten teeth all she could see other than the knife. As he moved to her, she looked around, her eyes flickering from side to side as she searched for some way out, only to find, just as it had been with Ramsay, there was none. She never even heard the sound of the arrow as it flew, nor did she see the man as he fell to the ground. Her eyes had closed as she'd prepared to accept her fate. "Sansa!" Theon called out, and then she was in his arms. Sansa welcoming the comforting feel of them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and she shook her head. Over his shoulder, she looked at the man who bled out on the ground of the septet. The arrow had caught him in the neck and punctured his throat, and yet she could barely see it. She sobbed as Theon held her, not out of fear or relief, though both were present, but out of gratitude. He'd saved her. Once more, when she'd needed someone, he had come and saved her. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she said over and over again as Theon held her in his arms. The guards came, and Sansa finally let Theon go. She, he, and the guards all walking from the sept and hurrying back to the keep. That Robin was almost apoplectic, that she'd nearly come to harm, only showed just how truly she'd ensnared him. Sansa welcoming the worry and concern that he showed, and the gratitude he expressed to Theon for saving his betrothed. After assuring him that she'd not been harmed, Sansa decided to use this to her benefit, almost smiling when Robin threatened retribution on those responsible. He said he was sent by the Queen. Sansa said to shocked gasps as Robin, Harold, Miranda, Yesela, and the Lords of the Vale looked on. "Cersei?" Lady Anya asked, and Sansa shook her head. "Cersei has had years to kill me, Lady Anya, and though I am no friend of hers, never has she tried to." "You believe Daenerys Targaryen ordered this?" Harold asked disbelievingly. "I believe so," she said, as she took a breath and waited for the questions. "If the Dragon Queen wanted you dead, then she could have just set her dragons upon you." "Lady Sansa," Lord Nestor said, "but had she then the North would know her and my half-brother for what they truly are. My lord, by the time she took her bath and bid Robin good night, she knew she had them almost convinced." Sansa smiling to herself as she climbed into her bed that night, she'd taken a terrible, almost fatal event and turned it to her advantage, had found the good in the bad and then used it for her benefit. Robin had sworn to bring the full might of the Vale down upon Daenerys, with only Sansa telling him they needed to be smart and find another way, stopping him from doing so, that it took more than one long drawn-out kiss to calm his ire, and that were it not for the ordeal she'd just gone through, it would have required more, something she didn't wish to think about. She slept comfortably, and the next morning, as she walked to break her fast, she was in a most excellent mood. Robin had put extra guards on her door, and they walked in front of and behind her, her betrothed showing how worried he truly was for her safety. As she entered the great hall, it became clear that something had happened, though. Something had occurred that she wasn't privy to. Sansa noticing the looks on the faces of each of the lords and ladies, and of Robin's as well. "What is it?" she asked as she sat down beside him. "A raven from the north, my love," Robin said, his voice soft as he reached out to touch her. Sansa trying not to move away and fighting her instinct to do so. "Has something happened?" "My sister, is she well?" she asked, trying to make the panic in her voice sound as if it was for Arya, and yet it was the looks on their faces as each man and woman looked to her that had really caused it. "Jon Snow is not your brother, Lady Sansa. He's not your father's child," Lady Anya said, and Sansa turned to face the woman who held the raven scroll in her hand. "That's my father," she said, trying to make sense of the woman's words. "Not her father's, Brandon. Her uncle. He was her uncle's son. This would be worse. Much worse." If true, he could paint her father and his line as usurpers. In a way, she was right, as she found out when she read the Raven Scroll that Lady Aenys soon handed her. Her father had indeed tried to usurp Jon's claim, first with his friend and then with her. But Jon wasn't Brandon's son, nor was he even Jon, and as Sansa read the words that were written, she found she had no idea what to do. To remove the dragon bitch's claim was one thing. To paint her as her father's daughter and tar her with that brush would turn Westeros against her. To do the same to the son of Aegon Targaryen was a whole different matter. Lies, lies, this is all lies. Rozier kidnapped and raped my aunt. She would never have married him. Never, do you hear me? Never, she said, screaming out the last bit. Around her, the lords and ladies of the Vale looked on, and as she shouted out that not only was Jon a bastard, but a bastard born of rape, she didn't see how they looked to each other. Had she then, she'd have calmed down, as she'd have realized it wasn't Sansa Stark that they saw ranting and raving, but her aunt. It was a comparison that had she known they were making would have made her panic even more. The neck 3005 AC. Agia. His kisses inflamed her, his touch made her shiver, and yet it was laying by his side that she found most comforting. Watching him while he slept was something she adored, even if it meant it deprived her of seeing how he looked at her. She rose and quickly dressed, and despite wishing to kiss his lips and wake him, Arya instead snuck from the tent and made her way to the open space to begin her morning ritual. She may not be no one anymore, but the training she had gone through was something that had saved her life on more than one occasion, and so it was something she continued daily. They were near the beginnings of where the North met the Riverlands. Jon had set up camp just before they entered the Riverlands themselves. Soon enough, they'd be in the south, and Arya both welcomed it and feared it in equal measure. The last time she'd traveled this route had been with her father, and it had taken her years to finally return to the North and home. By the time she'd lost two of her brothers, her mother and her father, and was parted from the rest of her family for years. She took a knee and prayed to the old gods and the new, to the many-faced god and to any god that listened. She prayed that this time it would be different. "I've seen it all now," Jon said from behind her. Arya, rising to her feet to glare at her brother. "You do know that's simply a bush, right? Not a weirwood sapling." Jon chuckled as he pointed to the berry bush she'd been kneeling at. "I wasn't praying to the damn bush, Aegon Targaryen," she said, rolling her eyes before ducking out of the way. When he went to grab her, the two of them laughing as she dodged him, and he kept coming towards her. After a few moments, they stopped, Jon looking at her and Arya, appreciating the concern in his eyes, knowing that the next words out of his mouth would be an expression of that concern. "This won't be like the last time, Arya," Jon said, and Arya felt her heart still as she realized that he had known exactly how she felt. "You can't know that," she said, meaning perhaps both, that he knew her mind in the words themselves. "I can and do." Robb was betrayed. Arya, as was the rest of our family. "I'll never allow anyone to betray either of us ever again." "Men betray, Jon. It's their nature. Women too, Raya. But the difference between me and them is I know what betrayal feels like. I felt it more keenly than anyone." Jon set his eyes unfocused as they looked off in the distance. It was true, her brother had been betrayed by those closest to him, and she felt her anger rise that their betrayal had almost managed to take him from her. Those men in black were lucky they'd already felt the power of her brother's resolve for him. Had they not, then they'd have surely faced her own. "You've taken steps?" she asked, moving closer to him. "There are few we trust, Arya, and Dany has known what it feels like too. We've taken steps, made plans, and are ever vigilant. Honor has no place in war, trust only belongs with those who've earned it, and those who seek to betray us will be dealt with." "We will deal with them together, brother," she said, and received a warm smile from Jon, Arya smiling back at her brother. He did that far more often now. Her brother was happy, and she was happy for him. It had made her own happiness something that she'd accepted a little more easily, too. Jon had told her that they deserved it, and though it had taken her a little while to believe him, in the end, he was right. She watched as he sat down on the grass, and she did her exercises. Arya, noticing for the first time that Jaime Lannister stood no more than 10 feet from Jon. She'd asked about the night and been told that he could be trusted, that he knew of Jon's secret before any not breathed a word, that he was loyal and true, and the man had even allowed her to play the game of faces with him, something that he won much to her surprise. There were others that she was less sure of. Ned Dane's cousin was one of them, and Tyrion another. Arya losing her concentration and stumbling to the ground as she thought of the dwarf. "Are you well?" Jon asked, helping her to her feet. I'm well, Aegon Targaryen, she said with a chuckle, when she saw his frown. Stop doing that, Jon said, looking at her. Doing what? She replied, as innocently as she could. You know what? Using your name, she asked, as Jon glared at her. Aye, especially when you're only doing so to irk me. It was true, she'd been doing it ever since they left Moat-Cailin. Arya had stood with the rest of the Northern Army, as Jon had told them all the truth of who he truly was. Her brother telling any man who felt he couldn't fight for him, upon knowing he wasn't Ned Stark's son, that he'd allow them to return home with no prejudice. That none had wasn't a surprise to her. They loved her brother, and after the battle for the Dawn, most saw him as the warrior reborn. There were some who'd been surprised and shocked, of course, and amongst the Dornishmen she'd noticed some strange looks. Ned Dane had asked for a meeting alone with Jon and been given one, while his cousin had simply smiled oddly. The biggest reaction came from Tyrion Lannister, Arya not liking how he looked at Jon and watching him far more carefully since then as a result. I'm sorry, she said as Jon mussed her hair. To them, I'm Aegon Targaryen, as I am to me, to Dainty, and to the dragons. Jon said, smiling, to you, I'm your brother, Arya, only ever that. You see me as Jon, and I know it's hard for you to see me as anything else. I know, little sister, Jon said as he leaned in, close to whisper in her ear. You're to be an aunt soon, Arya, he said, hugging her tightly. She spent the next couple of days watching Dany even closer, and she began to see the telltale signs. Jon explained to her that only those closest to Dany knew, and that for now they'd prefer to keep it that way. It made her feel even closer to him and to Dany, to feel even more protective of them both. Arya finding that when not with Gendry in their tent, she kept close by and watched their each and every move. When they reached the Green Fork, she noticed she was not the only one doing so, and so someone else fell under her watch now too. The Riverlands 305 AC. Dany! Aegon's announcement had gone down well, and Dany had breathed a sigh of relief when none of his men had turned to head for home. They could win this war without them, but she knew how important it was to seem to be united, and for Aegon, personally, a rejection from his men would hurt. Lord Wyman had taken his leave, and so had Ned Dane, the latter coming to see Aegon and her immediately after the truth had been revealed. That he had dropped to his knee and sworn fealty to her husband in front of her was something she was incredibly grateful for. Aegon explaining to her later that Sir Arthur had died to protect him and his mother, and to Ned that was all that mattered. Dany not needing him to tell her that it would not be so easy with the rest of Dorne. Tyrion had accepted it just as graciously. Dany happy to see him say he'd come around, or at least he was doing so publicly. He'd apologized to her for ever doubting Aegon, and said it was his perceived birth that had caused his distress, that he was, and could lie to her so easily, was something that only made what Aegon claimed he'd done seem ever more likely. Something she was even more sure of given his reaction to their march past Moat-Cailin and into the Riverlands rather than to White Harbor. She'd actually enjoyed his questioning of her about that, and had done her best to make it seem as if it was a spur-of-the-moment thing. I thought we were sailing to Dragonstone, Your Grace, Tyrion said. That was our plan, but events have forced us to change it. Events, Your Grace. The truth of Aegon is out there now. Tyrion, given the Riverlands, have declared for him. Thinking him Jon Snow, Aegon and I both agree that it's for the best if we meet with Lord Amir and the River Lords and see if their fealty has wavered in any way. Of course, Your Grace. Perhaps we should let Dragonstone know of these changes, he asked. No, let them think me coming. Should your sister have any spies on the island, then it will seem to be our destination. I think marching an army to King's Landing will make our destination clear, Your Grace, Tyrion said, looking at her intently. Which is why I've left orders for some of the fleet to sail anyway, she said with a smile. He'd sat with a sullen look each time she had caught him, unaware she was looking his way. Tyrion deep in thought, and Dany glad she'd taken Aegon's advice on how to deal with him. Suspicion was not proof, though, and only when they took to the air themselves would she find the full extent of Tyrion's loyalty or betrayal. For now, though, he wasn't what was truly on her mind, and instead, Dany found herself contemplating what to do about Sakharald. That he'd not left with his cousin had provoked a strange look on Ned Dane's face, and Dany herself had found it most odd. Only the man's looks and smiles at her showed that her suspicions regarding him had been true, and she cursed herself for leading him on at the feast. She'd not had the time to put him straight, and it needed to be done before Aegon decided to be the one to do so. Dorian already had enough of an issue with Aegon as it was. There was no need to give them another. Should Ser Gerold actually make a move on her, then Dragon Guard Ghost and their dragons themselves wouldn't be enough to keep her husband from ending the man there and then. With Aegon speaking to Kishuno and the Dothraki about the battle they'd soon be facing, and how it would be different than the one they'd just won, Dany decided that now was the time to deal with Sargerold, and so she sent one of her Unsullied with a note and told Sargerold that she was going to rest for the night. It was not something she wished to do, but even telling Jorah that she wished Aegon not to know of this was no guarantee that he'd not tell him. So after saying her goodnights to her bear, Dany covered up her usual white coat with one of Aegon's cloaks and snuck from the back of the tent. Put up she moved through the camp and was glad to see no one paying her any attention. She moved quickly and soon enough came to the river. See that Sargerold was standing beside the green fork, and he turned her way when he heard her approach. "Your Grace," the man said, smiling at her. "Dany was keen to get this over and done with." "Ser Gerold," she said as she took down her hood. "I've been longing to get you alone for quite some time, Your Grace," he said, moving toward her. "I believe you have the wrong idea, Ser Gerold, that night at the feast." "Where you all but threw yourself at me," he said with a laugh. "I did no such thing. That night was nothing to do with you, my husband." "Is not half the man I am," Gerald said, moving right next to her. "You really are a fool if you believe that," she scoffed. "On his worst day, my husband is 10 times the man you are. You got the wrong idea, Ser Gerold, and for your sake, I'd suggest you not get the right one. I have no interest in you, nor could I ever have." "Yet my own interest in you is true," Ser Gerold said. And as she slapped his hand away, she felt herself be turned around, the arm around her neck and hand covering her mouth, catching her by surprise. "Oomph," her words stifled by the pressure of the hand on her mouth. "You should feel lucky that I don't have more time. Had I then, the fun we could have," he said, laughing. "I'd show you what a true man does to a woman such as you. Alas, it's not to be, and while I'm sure bringing you alive to Cersei Lannister would see me well rewarded, you head will do just have to suffice." She heard the unsheathing of the blade and began to struggle against him, Dany biting down on his hand, only to find to her horror that it didn't make him loosen his grip. When she saw the white fur and the red eyes, she almost cried out in relief as Ghost moved silently toward them. "You call that thing off," Sargerold said shakily before moving her towards the water. "You call him off," Sargerold said, his voice more panicked, as Ghost silently stalked his way towards them, Dany soon feeling a point of the blade digging into her skin. How it happened, she knew not, only that she fell to the ground and held her throat as she checked to see if she'd been cut. She was relieved when she felt that while there was blood there, it was far less of it than there could have been. "Aegon," she shouted out, as she turned around to see where Ser Gerold was. That he was still alive was a shock to her, especially when she saw Ghost leaning over him, the wolf's paws planted on top of the unconscious man and making sure he couldn't move should he waken. Seeing Arya stand there with needle in hand was an even bigger surprise, and Dany quickly rose to her feet to hug her good sister, crying on her shoulder as she did so. "There ya. Thank the gods," she said, over and over. She heard them running, then, Dany, letting Arya go as she saw Aegon. Ser Jaime, Ser Jorah, Ser Brienne, Cuno, Grey Worm, Missandei, and a large number of others run her way. Her husband looked from her to Arya and Ghost, and then to the man who lay on the ground. He didn't say any words, and Dany welcoming being swept up in his arms. Aegon looking into her eyes, and she nodded before he held her tight and whispered into her ear. I'm sorry, he said as she shook her head and leaned more into his touch. She heard Arya explain what had happened, and Aegon gave some orders, her husband, the Dragon Guard, and Grey Worm all walking her back to the camp. Aegon never let her out of his arms all the way, and she felt at one point when she stumbled that he would have carried her in his arms had she allowed it. It was something she wished for but couldn't allow, as there was only so much weakness she could show her men, and this was not something for their eyes. Instead, she saved it until they were back in their tent, and once inside she just collapsed crying against Aegon's chest. I was such a fool. Our babe. Aegon. I put our babe at risk. All through her words, her husband just whispered that she was unhurt. Their babe was unhurt, and that was all that mattered. Dany, welcoming that there were no recriminations and no blame in Aegon's words, she allowed him to lift her in his arms and lay her down, his arms around her as she sobbed, and finally through sheer exhaustion, be it mental, emotional, or physical, she fell asleep. That she woke up more than once, crying in the night to find Aegon wide awake and staring at her, comforted her some, as did waking the next morning to find him still holding her in his arms. Aegon waiting until she was ready for her to tell him what she had done and why. "I need to deal with him, Dany," he said once. She'd finished, and she nodded. "You can stay here if you wish, Arya, Miss Dany. I'll get them to stay with you." "No, I understand," he said, kissing her, and Dany almost biting his lips so hungrily did she kiss him back. The thoughts that she had come so close to death only making her wish for all that life could bring, even more. "Take me, Aegon, please. I need you. I need to feel you." It was frenzied and fast. Aegon not wasting time in teasing her or bringing her to the edge, and Dany finding she needed neither. That she found her release was only partly down to her husband's skills. Her sheer need for it had propelled her to it, or so she believed. As they dressed, she found that she needed his touch, and Aegon obliged, his hands only leaving her own when she needed both of hers to put on her clothing. Even then, he stroked her back, caressed her shoulder, and more often than not, he rubbed her swollen belly, the feel of his fingers and of the dragon that moved inside of her, doing far more to make her feel better than any other words or actions could. When she was ready, he looked to her, and she nodded. Both of them walking from the tent, and Aegon leading her to the Green Fork itself. She saw Missandei look worriedly at her, and she smiled, her best smile to reassure her. Arya simply nodding, while the Dothraki and the Unsullied looked on. When she saw Surigrol tied to the tree with Ghost guarding him, she knew he was dying here this day. Aegon would have insisted upon it, and that he'd held back to comfort her was the only reason the man breathed still. Aegon held her hand as they stood in front of the man, her husband turning to kiss her before he let it go and moved closer still to the terrified Surigrol. "I can tell you things you need to know," Surigrol said, his voice almost breaking as Ghost snarled silently at him. "The only things I intend to hear from your lips this day are your screams," Aegon said as he took out a dragonglass dagger and stabbed Surigrol hard through the shoulder. The first scream soon wrought from him as Aegon twisted the dagger deep. She looked on as Aegon looked Ghost, the wolf moving closer, and then the screaming truly began. Ghost biting and biting down hard between Surigrol's legs, and Dany not needing to hear the sound it made as the wolf took his manhood away. Not that the sound of that could be heard over the screams of Surigrol anyway. This thing tried to take our queen from us. He tried to take our Khaleesi, the Khaleesi who right now in her belly carries the stallion who mounts the world, Aegon said, moving to her and placing his hands on her stomach. He kissed her once more, and then turned to Saradavos, and nodded. Then too, watching as he brought a chest forward and Aegon opened it, the egg soon held up high in his hands. "My wife carries a dragon inside of her. She carries our child, and this shall be its mount," Aegon said as he walked over to Surigrol and placed the egg underneath him. Dany looked on as Surigrol's blood began to drip all over the Orgiads. Aegon stepped away from him and began to speak again. "You dared to place your hands on my wife, dared think you could do so to a dragon, and there would be no consequences, that somehow your crimes would go unpunished. What is it you say to yourself, Darkstar, that you are of the night? Well, each of us here has seen what the night is truly like and what comes in it. The night, Surigrol, is dark and full of terrors, and after facing that, you pale in comparison." She felt them then and looked up to see Rhaegal and Drogon were flying towards them. The dragons soon landing as those around made the room for them to do so. Once they had, Aegon walked back to her and took her hand, leading her to stand in front of Drogon before he walked over to do the same to Rhaegal. Dany not needing to hear his words to know what came next, and yet she smiled when she did hear them. "I am Aegon of the House Targaryen, and I sentence you to die. You, like any who dares to try and harm my family, will learn that for that there can be no forgiveness, and the sentence for any who seek to do so shall always be the same. The words of my wife and mine house are known throughout the realm, and they are words that all should remember. You've spilled your blood, Surigrol. It's now time for you to face the fire." Aegon looked to her, and she nodded, Drogon and Rhaegal moving their heads as one, as were the words that came from her and Aegon's mouths. "Dracarys!" The flames soon covered him, and his screams were loud but short. The sound of the loud crack was heard over them, and as she looked to the flames, she saw it move. It flew from them. Dany smiling when it landed in her arms, the dragon rubbing its head against her belly as the fire burned in front of her eyes. While inside of her, she felt its rider reach out to touch it, too. King's Landing 3005 AC. Jon Connington. He readied the room and poured himself a drink, trying not to smile as he looked at it. There was a time that he thought he'd end up lost in a bottle, a drunk with no hope, no future, and no reason to live. Joining the Golden Company was something that, when he looked back on it, had saved his life. Even if his intent when joining it had been to end it in battle, he'd become fierce and had found the will to live, and then after their contracts were done, he'd drink himself into a stupor and try not to dwell on his mistakes. Over time, he began to do less of one and more of the other, and while he'd somewhat come to terms with not wanting to die, he'd still not really had something that he wished to live for. Until now he did have something to live for, and so he moved the chairs, placed the wine on the table, and waited for the sergeants and commanders to arrive. He didn't have long to wait. Bullock, Lysano, Garrus, the Peaks, and the Mudds, Brendel Byrne, Dick, and Will Cole, the Strongs, John Lawson, Tristan Rivers, and Franklin Flowers. While not the entirety of the company's leaders, it was the vast majority of them, and most of their true strength was now in this room. Jon waited until they took their seats, and they'd help themselves to the wine before he took his own. The proposal he was about to make them was for lesser coin than they were being paid by Cersei Lannister, but he knew they had no true love for this contract. Besides, the woman had paid them half up front, and so abandoning her wasn't as costly as it could be. Staying with her would cost them far more than coin, though, and no matter what they decided, his own mind was already made up. They could join him in fighting for the true king, or they could stand across from him on the battlefield and face his fury for not doing so. "Some of you may already know why I've asked you here," he said, looking to Baldock and Lysano. "Others may suspect it, and some, like old John Mudd, there won't have any idea whatsoever," he said to laughs, and a smirk from one of his oldest friends. "I'm just a man who loves a fight, John. I'll leave the thinking to the rest of you fools." Old John said to more laughs, "The stories we've all heard about the dragons are true, and 2 of them now come our way. Lysano will confirm to you that the war they fought, the war against those things, is over. It's done, and they were victorious," John said, smiling, as he did so. "Losses?" Franklin Flowers asked. "Minimal," Lysano replied before a look from John made him elaborate. "All in all, we have a little over 100,000 men coming our way," Lysano added. "Fuck me sideways," Tristan Rivers said. "Even for all the gold you wear, no one will fuck you. Sideways or not, you ugly cunt," Duncan Strong said to laughs. Jon joined in eagerly. These men, or some of them anyway, had become a family to him of sorts. He'd bled with them, saved some of their lives, and had his own saved by some of the men in this room as well. He hoped they'd see reason as the thoughts of what came for them and what would happen should they not turned his stomach a little. Taking a swallow of his wine, he readied to continue. Jon trying not to think back on the smell of burning flesh and the screams of a son as he tried to reach his father. "We cannot beat this army, and to fight it is folly. As I told that fuck, Strickland, when he took this contract, you've all seen the Ironborn. Would you trust any of them to guard your back in battle? Trust Euron fucking Greyjoy to see you home. As for the woman who sits on the throne, that woman lost all sense years ago. She'd see us all dead before she negotiated a truce, and even we of the Golden Company know the value of a retreat." Jon said to Nods, "I take it you have a plan, Jon. Otherwise, we may as all be getting drunk and sleeping with whores for all the fucking good." "This meeting is doing us," Loswell Peak asked. "You all know where my loyalties lay, and there are some of you in this room who shared those loyalties too," Jon said. "Aye, we did. But the dragons are dead, Jon. You yourself said that when we spoke of the girl." Brendel Byrne said, looking at him. "I believed it too, Brendel. I'd not have served Arya's daughter. We all heard the tales of her brother, and some of us saw it for ourselves too. In the end, the Mad King deserved his epithet, and hand on heart, I don't think there ever was a man who earned it more than he. You all know I served Rhaegar, and that it was he who I swore myself to, and though the girl was his sister, she wasn't him," Jon said, almost drifting off in remembrance. "The point, Jon," Lysano said, bringing him back. "Daenerys Targaryen is a woman now, Wid. She and the king in the north, Jon Snow, have married and intend to rule together. Now, no doubt all of you have heard from Snow and his briefings about this, Jon Snow, how he was named Lord Commander of the Night's Watch less than a year after joining, and how he held off the Wildings when they threatened to overrun the Wall. You know, he led an army to retake the north from the Boltons, and after doing so they named him their king. What you don't know is that he was their king long before they named him so. Jon, Bolek asked. Jon Snow is not Eddard Stark's bastard son. He is the true-born son of Rhaegar and Lyanna Targaryen. He is the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, and he, his wife, their dragons, and their armies now march this way, Jon said. The voices were raised in the room as they spoke over each other, Jon looking carefully at how they were taking the news. Those more politically astute among them could see what this would mean when it outed. A son was always more likely to gain support than a daughter or sister. That he had led men already and had won would only bring more to his cause, as would the crazed lioness that sat the throne. Taking another swallow of his wine, he readied to deliver the news that would make or break the Golden Company. "We have an offer from His Grace, from the one true king," Jon said as the voices quietened and people looked his way. "What kind of offer?" Balak asked. "One that doesn't involve us being burned alive," he said to Lass. He was about to say more when he heard the noise. The sound of footsteps as they ran up the stairs, catching them all off guard. The pained shouts coming from outside the door even more so. Young Jon Mudd jumped from his seat and opened the door and was then caught by an axe to the head. Jon looking to see men in Lannister colors, men of the Golden Company, and Ironborn all trying to fight their way into the room while the sergeants and commanders tried to stop them. "This way," he shouted as more of the men moved to the door and some moved towards him. Jon getting them to help him move the cupboard to reveal the hole in the wall. Looking behind him was looking into the Seven Hells itself. Gortz was being held in the air by the giant Kingsguard, his hands on either side of his head, and Jon turned away when he heard the popping sound. Ironborn were swinging axes and Lannister swords were thrusting and slashing, and though there were bodies of both on the ground, it was the Golden Companies that were outnumbering the others. "Come with me," he shouted as he moved through the hole in the wall. Balak, Lasono, and some others following him, though he knew not who else had made it even this far. He crawled for some time and then he dropped down into the room below, Jon waiting for the others to come behind him. 6 men were all that made it through, and he knew they needed to move quickly or they'd be joining the other dead men far too soon. Looking to the others, he saw it was Balak Lasono, Franklin Flowers, and Tristan Rivers, Duncan Strong, and Brendel Byrne, 6 out of almost 20 that had come to the meeting. Jon bid them follow him and led them to the stables, finding himself not sure how they'd managed to make it out of the city, but refusing to just stay and give up. "We can't ride, Jon," Lasono said as they stood near the horses. "I know, what the fuck just happened?" he asked, confusedly. "Strickland," Balak asked, "is a fool, but he'd not have the balls to do that. That was an execution, Jon, an extermination," Brendel said. "Shh, someone's coming," Duncan said, and Jon moved to the door. Taking his knife out, he waited for whoever it was ready to do what needed to be done. Had it been a man rather than a boy, then he'd have been gutted. As it was, Jon's knife went right over the boy's head, and when he looked at him, he knew immediately who he was. "You're one of Varys' little birds?" he asked, and the boy nodded. "Jon," Lasono asked. "We can trust him, Lasono," he said before turning back to the boy. "You can get us out of here?" he asked, and the boy nodded once more. The boy quickly led them down through an alley, and they stopped near its end, Jon and the others looking back and seeing the full force that had been sent to take them out. Had he not had a way out then, he and the others would have been dead by now. And as he looked at the soldiers and the men who led them, he felt his anger grow. The maester who served as Cersei's hand was out there amongst them, and standing right beside him was Harry Strickland. "No, my friend, not today," he said, stopping Balak from firing his bow and killing the traitor. "Come, we should leave while we can." Jon knew he was not the only one who'd looked how he did at homeless Harry. He'd underestimated him, and he would not do so again. Instead, he swore, when next he saw the man, it would end with one of them dead. And he knew that each of the 6 men that the boy had led through the back streets and alleys of King's Landing all felt exactly the same way as he. The Riverlands, 305 AC. Dany. She lay in the tent with the dragon asleep on her stomach, Aegon undressing before he lay down beside her. Dany could feel the connection with the red dragon, and yet it was muted. She was not its mother, and yet she felt as protective of it as if she was. Her husband had said it would be their babe's mount, and she was certain in this he was right. The red dragon itself seemed at its happiest when it was laying as it was right now, as close to the babe that grew inside of her as it could be. "Have you thought of a name for it yet?" Aegon asked before reaching out to softly touch the sleeping dragon. His hand then moving from it to the other dragon, who Dany somehow knew was sleeping too. "Her," she said, and Aegon looked to her. "You think it's a girl?" he asked, touching the dragon once more. "You think it's our babe's mount?" she asked, and he nodded. "I'm sure it is," he said, smiling at her. "I believe our babe is a girl. Again, in my dream, I saw both a boy and girl." "Twins?" he asked, and she laughed before shaking her head. "No, the girl was older, I believe. I think we named her Rhaella after my mother," she said, and he nodded. "And the boy, Aemon," she said. And before she knew it, Aegon was kissing her. "You'll crush her," she said, and then giggled as he moved quickly away. Her husband nowhere near the dragon, but she found it funny still. "And the dragon?" he asked as she looked at it, her hand reaching down to stroke its head before she closed her eyes. "Lord Yak's after both our mothers," she said, and looked at him. "Aye, that'll work," Aegon said, and she watched as he gently lifted the dragon and placed her in a small chest. "Sleep well, little dragon," Aegon said as the dragon chirped before curling up into a ball to sleep. Dany soon found herself smiling broadly as her husband moved his head to her stomach and began to tell Rhaella all about her dragon. That he was able to do so in a way that made it seem like a story from a book, only making her picture what it would be like when he was actually doing just that. Images of him sitting by a bed and reading their daughter and son to sleep soon filling her head. An image of her being held at knife point by Sergerold Deng soon replaced it, and Aegon moved to her as she tensed up and began to cry. Dany, what's wrong?" he asked, looking at her. I almost cost us everything, our babe." "Aegon, I almost cost us our babe," she said as he took her in his arms and allowed her to cry against his chest. "Even Dany, you almost is not doing so. You're here, our babe is fine, and will be born in peace, and together we'll watch her and her dragon grow. We'll see them, Dany, Rhaella, and Aemon will be there for them when they lose their first teeth, and there to kiss them and tell them everything will be all right, when they fall down and hurt themselves. I will not take such a chance again in the future. You made a mistake, Dany, a mistake, and what it could have cost only means that you'll never make the same mistake again," he said, looking to her. "I won't," she said determinedly. "I know you won't," he said before he kissed her again. When she had fallen asleep, she couldn't tell. She had snuggled up against him, and in just being held in his arms, she felt safer than she ever had. Dany soon finding herself lost to her dreams and to be walking on Dragonstone once more. "Munya," the voice called out, and she turned to see the girl walk her way. Her daughter no more than 7 or 8 name days, and already showing that she'd be taller than her when she grew older. "Yes, little dragon," she asked, smiling at her when she reached her. "Can we fly today, Munya?" Rhaella asked, her voice full of eagerness and hope. "When Capo returns," she said, as her daughter looked to the sky. "Rosier Lord Yaxley," she heard Rosiak say, and then she turned to look to see Rosiargiax. Logiarchors and Drogon were all flying towards them, her son's silver hair waving in the air as Aegon held him in front of him on Rosiargel's back. When the dragons landed, she laughed at how quickly her children swapped places. Yaemon running to her, while Rhaella ran from her and to her father. Dany laughing even louder as she was almost tackled to the ground by her son, her eyes on him and on her husband in the distance, where she saw Rhaella laughing as she was swung around in Aegon's arms. "Did you see me, Munya? Kepa let me tell Rhaella what to do. I made him fly so fast," Aemon said, giggling. "You did, my sweet, brave boy," she said as he hugged her. She looked on as Aegon and Rhaella walked over to Lyrax, the red dragon moving its head towards her daughter and Dany. Watching as just like she always had with Drogon, Rhaella too leaned close in to speak to her dragon. Taking Aemon by the hand, they both walked over to join the rest of her family. Rhaella looking eagerly at her as she hugged her husband, and then she moved over to stand beside Drogon. "We'll be back in an hour or so," she said, as Aegon turned to Aemon and asked him if he wished to spar, her son more than eager to do what, even compared to riding dragons, was his favorite thing in all the world. Aegon turned and helped Raziel up onto Aegon's back, and then Dany climbed up on Drogon's, her daughter waiting for her to give her the nod before they took to the air. Dany found herself looking over to her for the entirety of the flight, enjoying seeing the smile on her daughter's face and hearing the happy trills that Aegon made. Dany once again found herself thinking that this was one of her favorite things in the world. The only things that beat it was spending time with her husband in their bed, and when all four of them flew together, she woke up to find a pair of deep purple eyes staring at her, Lochier Ox looking at her as she stood on her stomach. Beside her again still slept, and Dany almost felt cruel waking him. Yet she knew that he'd not forgive her for letting him sleep in. As she was about to reach over to do so, Lochier jumped from her stomach and onto Aegon's chest. Dany looking at the red dragon as it cocked its head to look at her husband. The screech that then came out of its mouth made her laugh, as did Aegon's reaction. "What, I'm up, Aegon said as he jumped up with large yikes, holding onto his shirt so she wouldn't be dislodged. "That was all her," she said when he glared at her. Aegon soon shaking the remnants of sleep from his eyes. "Dragons," he said as Ghost walked into the tent. The White Wolf staring at the dragon stuck to Cragen's shirt, and Aegon looking to the wolf while rolling his eyes. Soon enough, Missandei arrived to help her dress, and Aegon placed the red dragon back into its chest. The annoyed sound it made was one Dany recognized all too well, as did Aegon, who chuckled before kissing her cheek. She dressed quickly and picked the dragon up before she then left the tent. Ser Jorah and Ser Brienne were both waiting for her, and Dany knew that from now on, she'd not only not be allowed to go anywhere alone, but that she had no wish to. "How far away are the twins?" she asked, as Jorah looked around for someone to ask, and as he did, Brienne answered instead. "We should reach them by nightfall, your grace," Brienne said. "Lord Aemir, you know him." "We met briefly, your grace. I know his uncle and Lady Catelyn both thought him less capable than he should have been." "I thank you, Sir Brienne. I think I'll join my husband and break my fast," she said, walking with the red dragon. Now on her shoulder for all to see, she found Aegon speaking to Ser Davos, and Tyrion, with Ser Jaime standing on guard behind them. Her husband was not looking best pleased, but he relaxed when he saw her. Taking a seat, she was soon brought something to eat, and found that Lord Hames was just as hungry as she, and so she fed her the meat, and watched her as she cooked it. Dindy asked about what had been discussed in her absence, Aegon telling her part of it, though she felt he was holding some of it back. "Lord Tyrion doesn't think we should arrive on the dragons, my love." Axe his tone, letting her know he disagreed. "Why not?" she asked with a nod to Aegon before she turned to look at Tyrion. "The Riverlords have already declared for his grace as Jon Snow, your grace. The news that he is actually Aegon Targaryen may change things, and yet they may still come around. Arriving on your dragons may seem as if you seek to force them to," Tyrion said. "Sir Davos?" she asked as she fed Learhax another piece of meat. "I think arriving with our army would seem just as threatening, your grace, so it's best for it to be a full threat than a partial one," Davos said. "We shouldn't be threatening them at all," Tyrion said, annoyedly. "We aren't. But having me arrive on Rhaegal's back helps to prove the truth just as much as the letters do. Let them be fearful of what may happen if they don't support us. A little fear isn't a bad thing, after all," Aegon said, and she nodded her agreement. "We march, and when we're close to the twins, Aegon and I will fly," she said. As Davos nodded, Tyrion's one was more reluctant, but still he nodded all the same. "The ships, Ser Davos?" she asked. "We'll arrive at Claw Isle the day after the morrow, your grace," Davos said, and she looked to Aegon, who sat with a determined look on his face. "Good," her husband said, and she hoped he was right. This plan of his was one she believed in, but as she looked to Tyrion, it was also one she hoped he was wrong about too. The twins 3005 AC. Admir, the Raven changed everything his lords said. Their oaths, his oath, were no longer binding, they said, and while he in some way agreed, in truth, they changed very little. Jon Snow, not being a bastard, bit a little for Edmure as he thought about how Cat had felt about the boy, his mind going to places he'd rather not, and yet he couldn't help himself. But think on. Would she have felt different had she known the truth? Would things have been different had they had a son of Rhaegar to name as their king? He wasn't certain about the former. He would have liked to think it would make a difference. but he remembered how much Kat had argued against the boy being named Robb's heir. The hatred she had for him ran very deep, and unless Ned Stark had told her right away, then he didn't know if she'd not have just found a different reason to hate him. On the latter, the more he thought about it, the more certain he was that it would have. The houses that were loyal to the Targaryens would have come to their side, as perhaps would one of the other kingdoms. With a son of Rhaegar to crown, they could have brought the Reach to bear, and then perhaps he wouldn't have spent years locked in a cell. Perhaps had it been so, then his sister and nephew would be here today. Looking down at the Raven Scroll and reading the words once more, he thought about Robb's will and what he'd signed his name to. By rights, he could deny it. Say it was to a brother of Robb Stark, and to a son of Ned Stark, that he'd agreed to kneel, and that since Aegon Targaryen was neither, then his fealty was his to give or take. He could but then what? Name himself king and face off against dragons and an army more than 5 times larger than any he could call on. No, only a fool would do such a thing, and the fool he once was had died many years earlier. "Come to bed, husband," Rosaline said softly, and Edgera looked up from his desk to see her standing at the door to their bedchamber. "In a moment," he said, and then he was smiling as she walked over and took a seat upon his lap, Edmure kissing her deeply as she placed her hand on his and took the Raven Scroll from it. "This bothers you, Syl?" she asked. "It does. I need to know that I'm doing the right thing," he asked, and she paused for a moment before she replied. "When I was a young girl, Pyrwin and Olivar brought me on a ride to visit our family at Roseby. It was long and hard, and yet, for me, it was wondrous. Being away from here and out on the open road, all of it like a great big adventure." Rosaline said, smiling as she was clearly remembering it. "How old were you?" he asked curiously. 9 or 10, name days," she replied before continuing. "We stayed in inns, taverns, and even one night under the stars." She giggled. "When we were close to it, Olivar suggested that we go and see Harrenhal. My brother was ever keen on the tales of dragons. Pyrwin agreed, and so we rode to it, and all I can remember thinking upon seeing it was that a dragon must be a terrible creature to behold. For only something terrible could have done to the great castle what Balerion the Black Dread did," she said, and he felt her shiver a little. "Rosier," he said softly, "Riverrun is no Harrenhal, my love, so don't let it become one," she said before looking deep into his eyes. "I won't," he said, and she nodded before looking at him, and Edmure seeing her desire in that look. "Now come to bed. I find I am missing my husband's touch." He woke early the next morning, broke his fast, and then spent the rest of the morning sparring. Edgera was keen to grow ever stronger, and Mark and Lemon both joined him as they did most mornings. They were having lunch when the first of their scouts arrived back, Edgera calling the man to speak to him as soon as he saw him enter. "You saw them?" he asked as Mark, Jason Mallister, and Lemon looked on. Rosine was feeding Cat and playing with Brynden a little further away from him than he'd have wished. "I saw them, my lord," the scout said. "And?" Lord Jason asked. "It's true, my lord. I've not seen the likes of it before. The Dothraki lines alone stretch further than the eye can see. As for the Unsullied, I didn't know men could march so." "The dragons?" Mark asked. "I didn't see them, sir." "The Targaryens?" he asked, and the man nodded. "Right at the front with their Kingsguard, 3 of them in white cloaks. The White Wolf walks next to them. Larger than any wolf has a right to be, that one. He's even bigger than King Robb's one was," the scout said, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. "You saw Grey Wind?" he asked with a sad smile on his face as he remembered his nephew's wolf, the smile soon turning to one of disgust when he remembered what they did to it. "I did, my lord. I marched with the king at Oxcross and saw the wolf take down more men than any. If the white one is as fierce and given his size I'd say he is, then he'd be even more dangerous. I'd wager—" "How long until they reach us?" Lamont asked. "Nightfall, my lord," the man said. He dismissed the scout and then turned to the others, seeing the worried looks on their faces, and he was actually glad to see them, as they would serve him far better than determined ones. Looking over to the table, he saw Brynden now playing with Cat as Rosaline held her in her arms. His son was being ever so gentle with his sister, as his wife looked at them both before she looked over and smiled at him. Edmure returning it warmly. "Still think that we should refuse to kneel?" he asked as he turned back to the men at his table. "There was no sign of the dragons, Edmure," Mark said. "Dragons fly, Mark," Lemon said to Chuckles. "We parley and then we kneel. Once we see the dragons," he said to Nods. Idmir was more than happy to accept them for now, and knew that he intended to kneel dragons or not,